Since it's now the beginning of December, we're 75% of the way through the 2022 NFL season. I thought it'd be a good time to dive into Dynasty wide receiver rankings. And no, not just my rankings or DLF rankings or even Dynasty ADP. No, I wanted to do something a little bit different, a little more objective. So what I did was I took every single receiver in the league right now. I calculated their fantasy points per game since the start of 2021. I took their current age, their current DLF ADP, mashed all of that together into one number, and I ranked Dynasty receivers that way. And what I hope this would do is remove a lot of the subjectivity of rankings with our personal biases towards players or age or production, and just boil down rankings into the three most important aspects of Dynasty: age, production, and value. So let's dive in. Coming in at number 12 is Garrett Wilson, who is the rookie wide receiver 2 in these rankings and actually one spot ahead of rookie wide receiver 3, Drake London. Ranking Wilson at wide receiver 12 is actually a bump up from his current DLF ADP of wide receiver 18, which I think is actually pretty significant. That basically means that community is not catching up fast enough on Wilson's value compared to a lot of other wide receivers. Sure, he's only averaging 12.4 points per game this season, which is by far the lowest of the top 12 receivers on this list today. But when you factor in his age, that production is much more palatable because it's a sign of much greater things to come, especially when you look at his splits with and without Zach Wilson this season. In 4 games without Zach Wilson, Garrett Wilson is averaging over 10 targets, 6 receptions, 77 yards, 1 touchdown, and 19.4 fantasy points per game. And then you compare that to 7 games with Zach Wilson, where basically every number is cut in half. Basically what that's saying is Zach Wilson just ain't it. And when Garrett Wilson is producing with Joe Flacco and Mike White, imagine what he could do with an actual starting quarterback. Now, the next 3 players, I'm just going to group them all together. So wide receiver 9, 10, and 11 are Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill, and Stephon Diggs. Basically, when you think of veteran receivers who should still be valued as Dynasty wide receiver 1s, you're thinking of these 3 guys. They're all elite fantasy producers. They're all actually currently inside the top 5 overall at the position as I'm recording this in week 13. And that's with Cooper Kupp missing the last 2 weeks from his high ankle sprain. These guys are fantastic. There's really nothing else to say about them except their age, which is the main reason why they are even fringe top 10 Dynasty receivers in the first place, is that they're all 29 years old, turning 30 next year. In fact, they're the only receivers in this top 12 ranking over the age of 26. They're just producing at such a high level right now that their age is not really important, but it will be this offseason in 2023, and I would expect all 3 of these guys to actually be sitting outside the top 12 by May when you include some rookies. So take that information as you will. Wide receiver 8 on this list is AJ Brown, which is actually a 5-slot drop from his November ADP at wide receiver 3. Now, a couple things are happening here that is lowering Brown using this method versus his ADP value, and the first of which is age, which, yes, he's only 25, doesn't turn 26 until next summer, but that is still 2 to 3 years older than everybody else above him, who are all 22, 23 years old. So when all their production is the same, most people for Dynasty are just going to take the younger guy. But that leads me to the second devaluing thing here for AJ Brown, and that is his production. And I said at the very beginning of this process is that it's looking at fantasy points per game since the start of 2021. But if you remember, AJ Brown was not great last year, not just because he missed games, but even when he did play, he was only averaging 13.7 points per game with the Tennessee Titans. Now, obviously, he's doing a lot better now, averaging over 16 points per game in Philadelphia, which has attributed to his rise in Dynasty value, but has he risen too far? Because even when I manually adjust his numbers to reflect his 2022 points per game, Brown only goes up to wide receiver 6, still 3 spots below his ADP. I think what this is really showing is how flat the second tier of wide receivers are for Dynasty, that goes from wide receiver 3 down to wide receiver 8. So just because Brown is lower on these rankings doesn't necessarily mean he's valued lower than everybody else in this tier. All right, moving on to wide receiver 7. It's Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver T. Higgins, which is actually a 4-spot boost from his wide receiver 11 ADP in November. Now, T. Higgins is a really, really good wide receiver. His only fault is that he plays on a team with an even better wide receiver. No matter what T. Higgins does, he's always going to be in Jamar Chase's shadow. And even if he outproduces Chase, he'll still be the second best receiver on his own team. But I mean, just look at the numbers. Over 15.5 points per game last year. This year, he's hovering right around that same 15 points per game again. Now, those aren't elite numbers, but they're still very good and they're consistent. He'll never see double coverage as long as Chase is on the field, and he can take over as the wide receiver 1 when Chase is off the field, as shown by his back-to-back top 6 finishes the last 2 weeks so far. He has more top 24 weeks on the season than AJ Brown, more top 5 weeks than AJ Brown, and that same thing is true with him versus Jaylen Waddle, and that same thing is true with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Higgins deserves to be in this second tier of dynasty receivers because he's young and producing, so wide receiver 7, T. Higgins. Taking a look at wide receiver 6, it's rookie wide receiver 1, Chris Olave. Yes, this is how high Olave should be when you just look strictly at age and production. What Olave has been doing so far as a rookie is honestly amazing. On just a 16-game pace, he is pacing for 135 targets, 80 receptions, 1,200 yards, and 5 touchdowns. I mean, that's really similar to what Michael Thomas did on this same team in his rookie season, but Olave is doing that with Andy Dalton and Jameis Winston, not Drew Brees. Then you take out week 1, you just used weeks 2 through 12, and his pace jumps to 85, 12, 50, and 6 on over 140 targets. That's basically what Jaylen Waddle just did last year. His floor is honestly like Hollywood Brown or DJ Moore, but his ceiling is Stephon Diggs potentially. He is that good. All right, top 5 time now, and our wide receiver 5 is Amon-Ra St. Brown, a 4-spot boost up from his November ADP at wide receiver 9. Actually, back in October ADP, Amon-Ra was valued as the wide receiver 3, which I thought was way too high, but in actuality, that was much closer to where he should be valued than his current wide receiver 9. I mean, just look at what he's doing. He's averaging 17 points per game this season and 20 points per game over his last 16 games dating back to last year. And that's including the couple of weeks that he was dealing with injuries back in October. He's just been so good week in and week out that he deserves to be valued this high. But I think the thing that stops a lot of people, myself included, when I saw him at wide receiver 3 last month, is some of our previous biases against him. I mean, he's a day 3 pick. We weren't very trusting of his production to end last season without DeAndre Swift, without TJ Hawkinson. They drafted Jameson Williams, and we're waiting for him to be the wide receiver 1 and push Amon-Ra aside. But what if, instead of all of that, the right answer of who Amon-Ra St. Brown is that he's just an elite wide receiver? You don't just produce like what he's been doing because you're the only guy in town. Now TJ Hawkinson is actually gone for good, and to be honest, I think Amon-Ra is more of a threat to Jameson Williams than Jameson Williams is to Amon-Ra. But even if both of them are great wide receivers, that doesn't necessarily stop them from both being great fantasy players. I mean, just ask Jaylen Waddle or T. Higgins or Tyler Lockett. It doesn't need to be that complicated. Just enjoy having a 23-year-old wide receiver who's producing 17 points per game for you right now, and value Amon-Ra as a top 5 dynasty asset. So wide receiver 4, I just mentioned him. It's Jaylen Waddle, the prime example of a player who can still be elite with another elite receiver across from him. Jaylen Waddle is just, I mean, he's just fantastic. What more do I need to say? Any doubts about his production with Tyreek Hill, this offense, or the quarterback throwing the ball to him have been answered very quickly throughout this season. Waddle is averaging over 17 points per game, slightly more than Amon-Ra, but if you compare both game logs, it looks like Waddle is a lot more boom bust than Amon-Ra, which comes more with just being the wide receiver 1B instead of the straight wide receiver 1 on his team. But for every 3 for 30 performance that Waddle gives you, he also gives you a 10 for 150 and 2 performance, and those weeks can happen at any given time. I absolutely love Waddle. I think he's an elite wide receiver in the NFL today, and he deserves to be the dynasty wide receiver 4. Moving on to wide receiver 3, it is CeeDee Lamb, as he is starting to grow into the player that we all thought he could be coming out of college, now that he is the alpha wide receiver 1 in Dallas without Amari Cooper. And perhaps the best part of this breakout 2022 season is he's doing it with and without Dak Prescott. I mean, just look at the splits this year. The numbers are nearly identical across the board between his time with Dak and his time with Cooper Rush. Now, maybe some of you take that as a negative a little because he's not any better with his top 10 quarterback than he is with his backup, but I choose to just take it as I just want CeeDee Lamb no matter what. 16.5 points per game is fantastic. His pace of 160 targets on the season, fantastic. His pace for over 1,300 receiving yards, fantastic. This is the CeeDee Lamb that we've been waiting for, and now that he's here, he deserves to be the Dynasty wide receiver 3. Then that leaves us with the obvious top 2, right? I mean, it's Justin Jefferson, it's Ja'Marr Chase, and in that order as well. The only way to describe these two is like how Justin Hammer talked up the ex-wife in Iron Man 2.
This is my Eiffel Tower. This is my Rachmaninoff's third, my Pieta. It's completely elegant, it's bafflingly beautiful, and it's capable of reducing the population of any standing structure to 0. I call it the ex-wife.
We know who these two are. We know the sheer upside, the dominance that they possess on a weekly and seasonal level. I mean, Ja'Marr Chase saw what Justin Jefferson did in his rookie season, said bet, and then beat it. I mean, this year, prior to his injury, he was on pace to then beat what he did last year with 115 receptions, 1,500 yards, and 14 touchdowns. And then there's Justin Jefferson, who has already put up what most receivers would call an elite season already in 11 games so far. And in fact, he has more games over 30 fantasy points this year than he does under 15 fantasy points. Like, that is just absolutely ridiculous production. These two are your wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 for probably the next 4 or 5 years at least, before we start worrying about age as they get into their late 20s. Oh, that felt weird, like late 20s, like that's old. The only player that I could see bumping either one of them before that, though, is Marvin Harrison Jr., who's basically going to enter the NFL as a Ja'Marr Chase level prospect in 2024. So if he has a rookie season like either one of these guys, he would enter Dynasty wide receiver 1 conversation, since he would be a couple years younger than both of them, but that's still 2 years away and dependent on a lot of things happening. But Justin Jefferson and Ja'Marr Chase, they're here right now, and they're on their way to just utter dominance this decade in the 2020s. Just in case anyone was interested, here's the entire top 24 wide receivers using this method of ranking. And I'm not going to run through any of the wide receiver 2s, but definitely drop a comment down below if you see anything interesting one way or another. And then, since we mentioned a couple rookie wide receivers in this video, if you wanted to check out an entire 2022 rookie redraft with everything that we know now today, you can watch that video right up here.